what I want to do is just show you that you can use a putty knife. Now, this is just an old putty knife that I'm using. One thing I did was I just sanded the edge a little bit and I round these edges. I don't know if you can see that they're just slightly rounded. If you use a putty knife straight from the store, those edges are really sharp. And what I like to do is just round these over using your electric sander or belt sander if you have one. Just nip those edges so that you don't have a sharp edge there. Because if you're going along and you just slightly twist, that's gonna leave a really bad gouge. So I like rounding those. So I'll show you, I'm gonna try to cut through now and just show you how it works with a putty knife. What's nice about doing this is you can get a lot of that really bad buildup off and then just go back and clean up with your steel wool, which is a nice benefit. But it won't get everything perfectly, but it will get a lot of it. And that's just gonna clear up the surface so that you can go back and spot treat it and use your steel wool. Instead of clogging up your steel wool and just trying to force it all off, you can just do that. Always go with the grain, ideally. Sometimes you have to just do it cautiously against the grain, but if you're able to go with the grain, then I would recommend it, just so that if there happens to be a scratch, it's in the direction of the grain, so it's a little easier to hide. But you can see this is a nice fast way to cut through the majority, not all, but the majority of the finish. And then you would just, what I would do is just gently go against the grain here, but be really careful. Don't press hard, just to clean up that. I'll put that down there, and then just come down on this side and just finish it off. And it's a nice way just to get most of that heavy buildup off so you can go back and spot treat it. But it's so nice to see that color just come right off, isn't it? It's rewarding. Just to watch it all go, and it just turns into this sort of molasses honey. And then mostly that's just the finish. I mean, yes, there's some QCS in there, but you're really just dissolving the finish and removing it. And so it's nice for that reason. You don't have all the filthy, goopy mess from the stripper too, because this is just really just a liquid that's dissolving into the original finish. So now you've got most of it off, you can just sort of spot treat it again. Question that we get asked quite often actually is, well, it's not so much a question, but it's referring to the cost of QCS. So like, you may be hesitant to use so much because you're like, well, it costs more than other products, so I want to conserve it. I would encourage you not to think that way. I know that is, it is the way that you're tempted to think because you're spending a good amount on the product, but really, again, if you just use the product, it's going to make the outcome so much better, and it's going to just make the process smoother. So it's worth it. If you tried to just force off this, this residue that's there still, like it would be miserable. You wouldn't have a good time doing it. By applying another light coat, yes, you've used more product, but if on this whole piece I use, even just if I use the whole bottle, I mean, again, this is a George Nelson piece. This is a valuable piece of furniture. It's $35. You look at that, it's like, that's not a lot of money to spend to have a nice, easy, safe process where I'm literally bare-handing this and not having to have to worry. That's awesome. Also, this is being that it's biodegradable and non-flammable. It's so nice because this can literally be done outside, and this is not any danger to the environment, so that's awesome. When you're removing the finish, you are adding in whatever that is. So you're adding in the finish into the mix. So you have to be cautious getting rid of that after, as you're scooping it off and you're getting rid of the waste, is put that somewhere and get rid of that appropriately. A lot of times just drying it out is enough. Putting it on some newspaper and letting it just dry out and then wrapping it up. Usually you could throw it away that way, but you want to check with your local area authorities on that. Make sure that that is the right way to get rid of that waste. But the nice thing about our product is that by itself, it is completely safe. This can literally be poured down a drain and, it's that safe. So I'm gonna let this set up a little bit more, and let me get another piece of steel wool here. Again, I'm gonna open this up, unroll it, kind of fluff it open a little bit and just make kind of one big pad. And there's, again, I didn't say this earlier, but you can apply QCS directly to the steel wool. You could go like this if you want to and just get it wet that way, or you can dip it, it's up to you. It's really just kind of using your judgment on these things. There's not necessarily a rule, it's more so just a wise, you know, judgment call. But you can see now, look at that, it's gonna cut right through, and you're not fighting all the finish off this time. So that's even nicer in a lot of ways, because you're just grabbing that little bit that's left. It's a little bit clingy to these edges, so I'm gonna apply some more there in a second and not try to fight that off, because it's not something you want to fight off. I'm gonna take and wipe off the majority of that residue now, and then let that sit for a minute. And I'm gonna come around here and just do this spot. Again, apply a little bit to the steel wool. Come in here. With steel wool, this is the single O steel wool. You could go with the grain. You're not gonna cause a lot of damage, if any, by going against the grain. Like if you do it circles, that's not gonna make a big problem typically. If you can go with the grain, that's just a little more cautious, but I wouldn't be super concerned about that. Do be careful, like right here, you can see some of the fibers. What could happen is this is a veneer, and I wanna point out, that's actually, side note, a really good point, that this is probably one of the safest ways to remove the finish from veneered items. If you go into grinding the finish off, you could burn through the veneer and really create a big problem. If you haven't ever seen what that means, Google burn through on veneer and you'll see lots of people who are probably crying and sobbing horribly as they've done something that they didn't mean to do. But you can get through this. It's just a thin layer of wood sitting on a core. And so if you sand it only, you could burn through that top thin layer and hit that core layer, and it changes the color. It really makes a big ugly spot. But you can see here some of this veneer is missing, and this corner is kind of exposed. Now if you're using steel wool and you grab a piece of that, it could rip off a chunk of the veneer. So be very careful when working around those types of problem areas. You can actually see over here, it may not show up in the camera very well, but in this spot here, you can actually see that someone has, and it might have even been from the factory, let me see if I can, but how it's darker right here, it kind of curves up. This area from pretty much down here up, it kind of curves around, that is burned through. So you can see the veneer here, and then the grain going kind of the other way underneath it, and the edge of the veneer, that is a burn through right there. So someone was sanding it with a flat, probably regular sander. This edge probably had a slight bow to it at some point, and they just burned through that high spot. And that's what you want to avoid. You don't want to do that as much as you can avoid it. It can be painted in later and fixed, but you want to avoid that kind of damage. So, but you can see how clean that came out. The putty knife method works really good. I probably would go the whole way with that, to be honest. I did the first two sides by scrubbing to show you that, but I think this way kind of cuts through it faster and gets you to the final result a little bit quicker. So not bad. We're getting there.